Your soulmate is about to confess why they married for money instead of choosing you. My beloved child. The confession you once thought would never come is closer than you realize, and when you finally hear why your soulmate married for money instead of choosing you, one detail may change the way you remember everything. Because this was never as simple as them loving someone else more. There was a moment, one they have replayed privately more times than they would ever admit. When they were almost ready to choose you. They had imagined what life beside you might feel like. They had even considered walking away from the future everyone around them expected them to accept. But then something happened behind closed doors. A conversation. A promise. And an offer carrying enough money and security to make them question whether love alone could protect the life they were trying to build. They made their choice, and you were left believing their silence meant you had never mattered. But that was only the version you were allowed to see. Don't skip, because the reason they are preparing to confess now begins with what happened immediately after they said yes to someone else. At first, they convinced themselves they had made the responsible decision. The marriage offered stability, comfort, status, and the kind of financial certainty they had spent years worrying they might never have. From the outside, everything looked settled. Yet there was one problem they could not purchase their way out of: you remained in their thoughts. Not as some perfect fantasy, but as the person connected to the question they were afraid to answer: what if I chose security and abandoned the one person I actually wanted? That question became harder to ignore whenever they remembered something painfully small about you: the way you listened when they were uncertain, the conversations where they did not need to pretend, the feeling that you cared about who they were before money entered the equation. And then, not long ago, something unexpected happened. They discovered that one of the reasons they had been so afraid to choose you was based on information that may never have been completely true. That discovery shook them because someone close to the situation had once convinced them that choosing you would mean instability, disappointment, and eventually regret. They were told that feelings would fade, bills would remain, and the safer future was the one already being placed in front of them. Your soulmate listened because fear can sound remarkably convincing when it arrives disguised as practical advice. But now they have begun looking backward with clearer eyes, and certain details no longer fit. A warning they once trusted suddenly sounds manipulated. A conversation they believed was meant to protect them now appears to have pushed them toward the wealthier choice. And that is why this confession is becoming impossible for them to hold inside. They do not simply want to tell you, "I married for money." They want to explain who influenced that decision, what they were terrified of losing, and why they stood there knowing part of their heart was still reaching toward you. Stay till the end, because there is one thing they did on the day they chose that marriage, something involving you, that nobody was ever supposed to discover. What they did that day has remained hidden because admitting it would expose just how uncertain they really were. Hours before making the commitment that would change their life, your soulmate searched for one last reason to stop. They checked for a message from you. Then they checked again. Not because you had promised to send one, and not because they expected some dramatic declaration, but because a part of them desperately wanted something, anything, that could justify walking away from the financially secure future waiting in front of them. They had already been told that choosing you would be reckless. Someone had repeatedly reminded them what they could gain by marrying into money: stability, opportunities, protection from financial pressure, and a lifestyle they had once believed would solve nearly every fear they carried. But while everyone around them focused on what they were gaining, your soulmate could feel what they were about to lose. And when no message appeared at the moment they were hoping for one, they interpreted your silence in the most painful way possible. They told themselves you had already moved on. That perhaps they had imagined the depth of your connection. That if you truly wanted them, somehow you would have known they needed you at that exact moment. It was an unfair expectation, and deep inside, they knew it. You could not respond to a question they had never been brave enough to ask. Still, fear needed an excuse, and your silence became one. So they went forward. They smiled when expected. They accepted congratulations. They allowed people to believe they had chosen exactly the life they wanted. Yet shortly afterward, something happened that cracked that carefully constructed story. Your soulmate learned that you may not have been as emotionally distant as they had assumed. Someone mentioned something you had said around that same period, something that suggested you had cared far more deeply than they realized. Suddenly, the entire decision looked different. If they had misunderstood your silence, what else had they misunderstood? And more importantly, who benefited from keeping the two of you uncertain about each other? That question led them back to the person whose advice had influenced them most. At first, your soulmate resisted the suspicion. They did not want to believe someone they trusted could have quietly shaped such a permanent decision. But certain memories began connecting. Every time your name came up, this person emphasized risk. Every time the wealthier marriage was discussed, they emphasized security. And whenever your soulmate considered speaking honestly with you before choosing, there always seemed to be another reason to wait. Something huge is waiting for you, because your soulmate recently confronted this person about what really happened back then. They expected denial. Instead, they received an answer that left them completely silent. The person admitted there was something about you they deliberately chose not to tell your soulmate before the marriage, and once your soulmate heard exactly what had been hidden, they finally understood that their decision may have been built on more than fear. The hidden truth was painfully simple: you had never been the hopeless choice they were led to believe you were. Before the marriage, someone had learned that you were willing to build something real with your soulmate, even if the beginning would not have looked glamorous. You were not promising instant wealth or an effortless life. You were offering something quieter: loyalty, patience, and the willingness to grow together. But that message never reached them in the way it should have. Instead, your soulmate kept hearing that you were uncertain, that you might disappear when life became difficult, and that choosing you meant gambling their entire future. Now they realize how much fear was placed between the two of you. And when they confronted the person who had withheld the truth, the explanation was almost worse than the secret itself: "I thought I was protecting you from making an emotional mistake." Those words have been echoing in your soulmate's mind ever since. But here is where the confession becomes harder. Your soulmate cannot place all the blame on someone else. They know the final decision was still theirs. They chose the comfortable road because money answered fears that love could not immediately silence. They were afraid of struggling. Afraid of disappointing their family. Afraid of looking foolish if choosing you did not work out. And somewhere inside all those fears was another one they have barely admitted even to themselves. They were terrified that you had the power to truly hurt them because their feelings for you were real. Choosing someone for security felt controllable. Choosing you would have required vulnerability. That is the part they are ashamed to confess. Money was not simply something they wanted. It became a shield. And now that shield feels heavier every time they remember the person they walked away from to obtain it. Don't skip, because what happened next forced them to stop pretending they could bury that decision forever. Recently, your soulmate found something they had kept from that period of their life. It was not expensive. It had no financial value at all. Yet the moment they saw it, every carefully buried emotion returned. It reminded them of a conversation with you from before everything changed. A moment when you spoke about the future without knowing how close they were to making a decision that would separate you. They remembered wanting to tell you the truth that day. They almost did. But fear stopped them, and afterward they convinced themselves silence was kinder than admitting they had chosen financial security over what they felt with you. Now they understand that silence may have caused the deepest wound of all. That is why they are preparing to confess. Not to erase what happened, but because they can no longer let you believe you were simply unwanted. Yet there is still one part they are terrified to reveal. The exact reason money had such a powerful hold over them in the first place, and it reaches much further back than you know. The reason money controlled that decision began long before you ever entered their life. Your soulmate had spent years quietly associating financial security with emotional safety. They had watched what uncertainty could do to people, how constant worry could turn affection into arguments and promises into pressure. Somewhere along the way, they made a private rule: when the time came to choose a future, they would never choose a life where money could become a daily source of fear. Then you appeared, and suddenly that rule became complicated. You offered the connection they had secretly wanted, but you could not guarantee what tomorrow would look like. The person they eventually married could. So when the choice arrived, your soulmate did not compare two people fairly. They compared their feelings for you against their deepest fear of instability. And fear won. But there is something they never admitted about the night they finally made that decision. That night, your soulmate actually imagined two futures. In one, everything looked impressive from the outside. Financial comfort, approval from others, predictable plans, and fewer practical worries. In the other, there was you. That future was less certain, but strangely, it felt more alive. They imagined ordinary mornings, difficult seasons you would face together, laughter that did not need an audience, and the freedom of being loved without constantly proving their worth. For several minutes, they almost chose that second future. Then came one final conversation about money. They were shown numbers, possibilities, and opportunities they feared they might never see again. The message was clear: walk away from this offer, and you may regret it forever. So they chose the future that looked safer on paper. Yet after making that choice, the first person they thought about was not the person they were going to marry. It was you. Stay till the end, because that was when they did something nobody around them noticed. They wrote words meant for you and then never sent them. Not a dramatic goodbye. Not an attempt to make you chase them. It was an explanation they were too ashamed to deliver. They admitted that their feelings for you had not disappeared, but they were choosing certainty because they were frightened of what love could not promise. They even wrote that part of them hoped you would someday understand, though they knew they had no right to ask that of you. Then they deleted most of it and kept only a small fragment hidden away. For years, they avoided looking at those words because they proved something uncomfortable. They had known exactly what they were sacrificing. But recently, they found that fragment again. And this time, instead of closing it, they read every surviving word. One sentence stopped them completely because it revealed what they had secretly hoped would happen after the marriage. And that hope is the part of their confession they are most afraid for you to hear. That surviving sentence exposed a contradiction your soulmate had spent years trying not to face. Even while choosing a financially secure marriage, some part of them hoped you would not disappear from their life completely. They wanted the safety of the decision they were making without accepting the full emotional cost of losing you. It was selfish, and they know that now. In those hidden words, they had written that perhaps someday, when everything became calmer, the two of you could finally speak honestly about what had happened. But someday became an excuse. Weeks passed. Then months. Each time they considered reaching out, shame stopped them. What could they possibly say? That they had chosen money because fear felt stronger than courage? That they still wondered about you after promising a future to someone else? So they remained silent, hoping time would erase the question. Instead, time made it louder. Then came the moment that changed how they viewed the life they had chosen. It was not a dramatic argument or some sudden collapse. It was quieter than that. Your soulmate achieved something they once believed would make them feel completely secure. There was financial comfort around them, exactly as they had wanted. Yet in that moment, instead of feeling fulfilled, they remembered something you once said about success meaning very little if you could not be yourself inside the life you created. That memory hit differently now. They began asking whether they had confused being protected with being happy. And for the first time, they stopped blaming circumstances, family pressure, or outside influence. They looked directly at their own decision. They understood that money had offered genuine security. But they had demanded something from it that money could never provide, certainty that they would never feel regret. Don't skip, because that realization pushed them toward a decision they had avoided for far too long. Your soulmate began preparing the confession you were never supposed to hear. They went back through old memories, not to romanticize the past, but to separate what actually happened from the excuses they had repeated for years. They remembered where they were when they decided against choosing you. They remembered the unsent words. They remembered waiting for your message even though you had no idea they were waiting. And then they admitted something devastating to themselves. They had secretly made you responsible for rescuing them from a decision they were too frightened to refuse. If you had appeared at exactly the right moment, they might have chosen differently. But when you did not, they used your absence as permission to take the safer road. Now they know that was never fair to you. Yet before they confess everything, there is one final truth they must decide whether to reveal, because after choosing money, there was a moment when they were given another chance to contact you, and what they did with that chance may surprise you most. That second chance came sooner than your soulmate expected. Not long after the marriage, your name appeared unexpectedly through a conversation with someone who still knew both sides of the story. They were told that you had asked about them, not desperately, not trying to interfere, but because you genuinely wanted to know whether they were okay. For a moment, your soulmate felt the door they thought had permanently closed move slightly open. They could have sent you one honest message. They could have finally explained that their choice had been driven by fear, financial security, and pressure rather than an absence of feeling. They even picked up their phone and began forming the words. But then they stopped. Because contacting you would have forced them to admit something they were still desperately trying to deny: the life they had chosen had not erased what they felt. So instead of answering the question you never knew had reached them, they remained silent again. That silence became another regret. Your soulmate told themselves they were protecting everyone involved, including you. But with time, they recognized another truth underneath that explanation. They were protecting themselves from consequences. If they spoke to you, you might have rejected them. You might have asked why they had chosen money over a real connection. Or worse, you might have said you would have stood beside them through the uncertainty they were so afraid of. That possibility frightened them because it would confirm that they had walked away from something genuine without ever giving it a fair chance. So they buried the moment. Yet recently, while preparing to confess, they learned what happened on your side after their silence. You eventually stopped waiting for an explanation. You began accepting that perhaps there would never be one. And when your soulmate understood that their silence had helped create that distance, the excuse they had carried for years finally collapsed. Now they are facing the confession differently. They are no longer imagining that telling you the truth automatically earns forgiveness or changes the past. They understand that you may hear everything and still decide their reasons are not enough. What matters is that you finally receive the truth they should have given you before making that choice. They want you to know you were not rejected because you lacked value. They chose money because financial certainty spoke directly to fears they had never healed, and because they lacked the courage to risk an uncertain future with someone they deeply cared about. But there is still one detail they have not told anyone. Stay till the end, because while revisiting that second chance to contact you, your soulmate discovered that the person who originally pushed them toward the wealthy marriage knew you had asked about them, and deliberately kept one crucial part of your message from reaching them. What was kept from them was not simply the fact that you had asked how they were doing. There was another part of your message, one that would have challenged everything your soulmate had been told about you. You had made it clear that despite what happened, you never wanted them to believe your feelings had been meaningless. You were hurt, confused, and trying to respect the choice they had made, but you had not suddenly stopped caring. That part never reached your soulmate. They were only told enough to believe you had casually asked about them and moved on. When they discovered the full truth, they sat with it in stunned silence. Because suddenly, two separate moments connected. Before the marriage, they had been encouraged to believe you were too uncertain to build a future with, and afterward, evidence that you still cared had been softened before reaching them. Someone had been deciding which pieces of the truth your soulmate was allowed to see. But your soulmate also knows something important now, discovering that manipulation does not erase their responsibility. They could have come directly to you. They could have asked questions instead of trusting assumptions. They could have chosen love despite uncertainty, or at least given you an honest explanation before choosing money. They did none of those things. And that is exactly why this confession has become so difficult. They cannot arrive with excuse.